Hi, welcome to Shelf Starters. Here I am with Mum. I'm in London now and Mum's in Sydney, so this is the first time we're doing this from different locations. Today, thanks to summer, we remember that it is actually Aussie April, which is a big event on BookTube, celebrating the writing of Australian authors, which is really exciting for Mum and I because we're both Australians, obviously, and have grown up loving Australian literature. So it's kind of great timing that we're starting our channel right during this moment. So I thought today that we could share our top 10 Australian writers and give you some recommendations.
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe what I thought we could talk about before we jump into some of the books is what makes Australian literature so unique and great for other cultures to read as well as just Australians. What is so unique to us?
I would say, a couple of things, but I think probably the first thing I think of is the relationship between character and landscape. The landscape almost taking on the role of a character, really, in many, many Australian works, I think. The power of the landscape and the veneration we hold for it, but also the spiritual connection, I guess, that is often tapped into by writers, Australian writers.
And I think also that Indigenous influence as well with the spirituality. That, whether or not you are an Indigenous Australian author, I think it is something that we all feel.
Part of our culture, and we feel.
Yeah, it's part of the culture. It's been a big influence for sure. Definitely. And definitely that the landscape has been so strong and powerful that it is like a character in itself.
Well, look, it's way back, Henry Lawson's short stories. That's where they began, really, in rural Australia, in that isolated outback setting that's hard and unforgiving, that Dorothea McKellar made so famous in her poem. So, yeah, and you see it reflected in works, even in most contemporary ones. And whether that landscape is rural or it is, in fact, the seascape, it's very, very powerful. So I think that's one element that's very much part of our culture in Australian writing. But I think character as well, voice, that irony, that gentle irony, that humour, that self-deprecating humour, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
which I really enjoy. It makes the characters, all of them, kind of underdogs, I suppose, in a way, and really appealing. They're not arrogant usually, and I like that. Yeah,
they're down to earth usually. I think that's kind of how people see Australia as a culture as well.
Absolutely. And down to values as well, Rosie. The values like mateship. That's such a strong theme. So, and that is reflected in that gentle humour and that irony.
So, shall we go one by one through our top authors, and I'll link them in the description down below as well, so you can check them out later.
I guess the one who springs to mind, I guess, for me is Tim Winton. The novel Cloudstreet, I just loved. I read it a couple of times over and fell in love with it. And then I remember we bought the audio tapes to play while we were driving from our home in Sydney to our rural place to stay, which was a mud brick house on the coast in north central New South Wales. And we listened to that saga all the way up.
Definitely way too young.
Yeah, absolutely. But
I think because it is that family saga, even if it's not the right age for children, I definitely would not recommend this for children. It was kind of something that you could still relate to, so it didn't feel like it was too hard for a child to understand.
No, the characters had such strong voices, and the love between the characters was so clear. I think that that you could pick up on that as a child without understanding the nuances and the more difficult themes that ran underneath, which were that connection to our Indigenous history and our treatment of Indigenous people that haunts in the background of that story, or it's the undercurrent of the story. But it is beautifully, beautifully written. The female characters, I think, are
incredible, which is so rare for a male author, to really understand the voice of
Winton said he modelled those characters on his grandparents, and he had these two strong voices for grandmothers, as grandmothers, and he drew on that to create Dolly and Oriole. I mean, an Oriole classic, described as a wardrobe with legs, but a fierce little woman, a fierce, strong little woman who holds everybody together. And then, of course, Dolly, the other.
And Rose. I loved Rose as well.
I loved Rose too.
Rose when I was younger. She was there, so she's one of the young daughters, and you start when she's really quite young. She finds this room in the house that she claims is her own.
Yes.
And falls in love with books and things like that. So I really related to her.
Yes.
We probably should explain the story.
Sure. So it's there's a family who is down and out. The father is a gambler, and he loses all his money, and they face terribly hard times in the Depression, and he inherits a house. He
gets the house in the will, and part of the joke is that the deal is he has to keep the house for 20 years, and when they turn up, the house is a complete ruin, and so they're like, well, this is actually more like a curse to be given this house than actually good luck. So and it's too big for them to maintain on their own.
Yes. So they take in another family, and they actually divide the house in half. They have like a border, a line over which neither family must cross. And it's about the relationship that develops between them all, despite the beginnings, and the humour, the hysterically funny scenes that ensue.
Which I still think of now. Like that book has stuck with me probably the most of any book that I've ever read throughout my life, because there are scenes that it's quite long. Yes. There are scenes that I still remember to this day, and I do go back and reread it often actually, and I do recommend the audiobook because it gives you that Australian accent, the voice that you really want to.
The voice is fantastic.
My first recommendation is Jane Harper, and I only she's a relatively new author in the last few years or so. She's a crime writer, an Australian crime writer, and for me, just from the very first book I read by her, which was The Dry, I knew instantly that I will read anything that she ever writes. And so now, anytime she comes up with any new crime mystery novel, I am straight there. What's so great is that it has that emphasis on the Australian landscape behind each of the stories. And I mean, it's the perfect setting for crime. It's
absolutely. I mean, The Dry, that gothic, literally a rural setting in drought, an isolated, again, isolation being the key theme here. A small town, isolated anyway, but obviously devastated by the drought.
And people are just trying to survive.
The thick red dust that just pervades every scene. And the loneliness of the characters, and I guess hence the quirkiness. And hence they all, could be potential suspects.
So The Dry is the beginning of her first book in her series following this detective called Aaron Folks, I think, who comes back to a town. He's made it in Melbourne as this top cop, but he gets drawn back to his hometown because there's a murder-suicide with involving one of his childhood friends. So he's drawn back in to investigate that and to find out what really happened, because most people in the town don't believe that that's really what happened, and they think that it may have been a murder situation. So it's so gripping. The relationships, again, just so believable.
Someone who doesn't struggle with the authenticity of any voices, I think, is Craig Sylvie. That's my next one.
I have one by him.
Yeah, that's absolutely great. Honeybee, that's the most recent one. So Craig Sylvie wrote Jasper Jones, which is an Australian, has become really an Australian classic. It's known as the Australian version of To Kill a Mockingbird by many. And he actually notes the influence of To Kill a Mockingbird on his work and his entire ethical framework, he said. And he reads it every year. He returns to that novel every year, which is fun, Rosie, in that that was one of the novels that really set you on fire. But anyway, that's the Craig Sylvie. That was his first novel that he, won fame and fortune for, or hopefully some fortune. But Honeybee, the most recent one, is a beautiful story of a relationship between a young boy whose family is highly dysfunctional, and he forms a bond with an older man. And it's a lovely relationship that gives him hope, really. And it's really a lovely novel about forgiveness and letting go in the end.
Okay, so another author that I've recently discovered who is an Australian writer writing from Tasmania is Robbie Arnott. And Mum, I think you have read the first one, which is Flames by him. But probably don't remember it too much. I read it, I think, maybe a couple of years ago now, so my memory is a little bit hazy, but I remember absolutely loving it. I think the main thing for this one was he's got quite an element of magical realism. His writing is really lyrical and beautiful, and it's all about sort of parts of the landscape taking on this sort of mystical, quite surreal persona. Yeah, so it's sort of a surreal, mystical kind of take on the Australian landscape. And I believe Flames was all about the bushfires.
Yes, that's right. And that actually, do you mind me jumping in with Richard Flanagan?
Yeah, no, go.
So Richard Flanagan, the author of The Narrow Road to the Deep North, I not long ago read his work, The Living Sea of Waking Dreams, which is also an experiment with magical realism, which I normally dislike. But this book...
Do you though? Because actually quite a few of the authors on our list are really into magical realism.
Yeah, Isabella Allende, I enjoy her thoroughly. So yeah, maybe I think I don't like it, but anyway, this Flanagan novel I found to be just so moving, beautifully put together. Not an easy topic. Again, dealing with family. So it's a family of 3 siblings dealing with their aging mother, who is and what to do with her in her final years. It's set in Tasmania. He wrote it after the fires, when the town was being eaten up, basically. Not the town, the whole island was being eaten up by fire, and that's when he wrote this book. And also the beginning, then that was followed by COVID. So it's an interesting time of it being published. But what happens is there are 3 siblings. There's the well-off brother who is out there making a killing, money market. There's a banker, and there's a very strong daughter who is a corporate woman also. And then there is the son who has never left home, and he's with the mother the whole time. And then as her health takes a terrible turn, there is a big decision about what to do with her. But the magical realism is really interesting. So that's when the daughter is with her mother, but she finds parts of her body keep disappearing. So it's like a giant metaphor, I guess, for aging and questioning your role and who you are.
Yeah, I liked that one.
It's so good. It's so good. That takes me to Trent Dalton, the Boy Swallows universe, and then All Our Shimmering Skies, which is the most one.
Yeah, that's the most one. I also haven't read this yet. It's on my list.
It's a must read, of course. Again, about natural order, about death,
and magical realism.
Yes,
that's that one.
And a little girl this time. I think he said that his daughter had actually complained that he hadn't written a girl's perspective, and he has.
Oh, so you mean in this one? This one's about a girl.
Yes.
Okay.
Whose best friend is a shovel. Yeah.
Oh, it's a grave digger's daughter. It says on the back. So of course.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and her best friend is in fact the shovel, and it's quite metaphysical. It's lovely. It's a lovely read. I really enjoyed The Boy Swallowed Universe, and this is something quite different.
So The Boy Swallowed Universe was about a boy in a like low income household
and very dysfunctional family. Yeah.
And there was a storyline about drugs.
I mean, it goes to very dark places. drug addiction. The scenes, you know, the mother and the drug addiction, and then the stepfather or the partner, and the crime, and what they expect the boy to do. They have their son be the drug mule.
So my next one is one that probably people are quite familiar with, thanks to the HBO series, and that is Leanne Moriarty, who of course wrote Big Little Lies. I have a real soft spot for Leanne Moriarty. I've read all of her novels. I think they're so much fun. They're very light reads. It's always some sort of light mystery kind of thing, usually centering around women. I find the characters quite real. I find the descriptions of places quite real. It's less of that rural stuff, more suburban kind of dynamics, and I really, really enjoy it. The most
and strong friendships between women,
strong friendships, and also family relationships as well. And
dealing with that issue of abusive relationships.
Often.
Kate Grenville, I want to talk about her, a roommate of Leaves, where she looks at Elizabeth MacArthur, the wool baron's wife, and tells a story from her perspective, which contradicts much of the history we have of MacArthur and the role he played in New South Wales. And it's what Kate's done is created What If I Were to Find the Diaries of Elizabeth MacArthur, and they revealed a very different side of the story. Very, very, I loved it. I know you weren't so keen, Rosie, but I thought it was
I liked it. I just was, I think I had such high expectations because I'd read The Secret River by her. Do you want to talk a bit about The Secret River as well?
Yes, that is a beautiful book, dealing with all the things we've talked about. Isolation, the power of the landscape, the harshness of the people who have to deal with the landscape and live with the landscape.
Resilience, really.
The resilience, but the awful treatment of Indigenous Australians, the violence.
It follows a convict, so a man who is arrested for something very, I think, stealing bread, which is the classic convict story. It's something very, very simple like that, and his family gets sent off to the colonies in Australia, in New South Wales, and he has to set up and try to make something of himself in this rural landscape with absolutely nothing there. And his wife's big dream is that they'll make enough money to be able to afford to go back to London, because she misses it so much, and she identifies more with London as her home. But gradually, as they go along, the husband is loving it in Australia, despite how hard it is to live on that land.
He sees an opportunity. He sees an opportunity for fortune and land, which he never would have, obviously, in England. But again, the strength of his wife, the resilience.
Living, like a hut kind of thing, and having children and things like that in that landscape with no medical attention.
Befriending Indigenous local people, learning to understand their language. It's very much a book about language.
Yeah, the interaction with Indigenous Australians in that book is really important, and often quite confronting. Like you said, the treatment is awful, and the violence that was done against the community.
It was made into a most beautiful piece of theatre. So it was adapted to a play.
Yes, which I saw in London. It came to London.
I think it's your birthday.
The National Theatre, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
It was really, really great.
It was a wonderful piece of theatre. It really was. It was.
So on the topic of Indigenous authors, I do have one I want to mention. I have to say this is an area that I would love more recommendations from any viewers, because I've struggled to find contemporary Indigenous authors, Indigenous Australia, but one that's doing amazingly is Jane Winch, who's recently released The Yield, which follows an Aboriginal man called Gondiwindi, and he's getting to the end of his life, and before he dies, he wants to record his people's language. So he's creating this big dictionary of Indigenous terms. And then we follow, so there's two timelines. There's him compiling this dictionary, which is great because it's you can read the entries from the dictionary as well as a reader and learn some Aboriginal terms, which is really interesting for me as well as a linguist. But then, yeah, we also follow the second timeline, which is his granddaughter coming back after his funeral and coming back to her family home to discover what's happened to all of her relatives who she's lost contact with over time, and also try to save the land that their family is on, because it's been threatened by, you know, classic corporate trying to build over the land and take away that community from them. So yeah, a really great read. I've only read that one by her. I believe she's also written some great short stories as well. Okay, so the I think we've covered all of the kind of our top literary fiction authors.
Yes.
But I wanted to add one more who's a relatively new author as well, which is Jessica Townsend, and she writes middle grade, so books for children. Yeah. And I have fallen absolutely in love with the world that she's created. So she's got this new series, I think there's only 3 books out at the moment, called Nevermore. I think it's actually got, the Nevermore's the first book. I'm trying to think what the actual whole series is called. It's like the Trials of Morrigan Crow. So it follows this little girl called Morrigan, who gets called Mog later, who is a cursed child. So she's told that she's blamed for all of the bad things that happen in her town. So anytime there's any kind of mishap of any kind, they're like, it's Morrigan's fault, even if she's nowhere near, you know, your cat goes missing or whatever, Morrigan did it. So poor child has the whole town hating on her from the time she's born. And she's told that, I think when she turns 11, she will die. She's going to be, you know, taken away by death or whatever. And so it gets to approaching her birthday, and she's realizing, you know, her time is up. And this mystical, crazy, eccentric man comes and whisks her away to a different world called Nevermore, which is just a very quirky, topsy-turvy kind of place. So imaginative. They ride, instead of like flying, they ride on umbrellas on like what I kind of imagine to be like a telephone line. Like they hold onto them and go along like that. And it basically follows
like a flying fox.
Yeah, like a flying fox. Yeah, exactly. And he lives, this man who takes her away is called Juniper North, and he lives in Juniper actually could be Jupiter North, who lives in a hotel, and this hotel is the most magical, imaginative hotel. Every room adapts to the inhabitants, so, and it's different every single day, so it fits your mood and turns into, you know, if you're feeling like you need to relax, it'll give you like a hammock, and it has different like chandeliers and things like that that reflect your personality, and so it learns you as you go along, so it's like gradually becoming more to your taste. And there's a big magic cat that's like the size of, you know, a bear, and all these other wonderful creatures and things. And her goal after being taken away is she's going to try to be accepted into this wondrous society, which is a magic school. So it's all about her trials to get accepted into the school and all the different tasks that she has to do. Kind of like, I mean, it's very, very similar to Harry Potter. It's kind of the new Harry Potter for children, I think. In some ways, even more imaginative, which is hard for me to say because I do love Harry Potter, but I think in some ways it's even more whimsical in that sense. And yeah, she has to go through all these different trials and things and meet all these other little kids, and it's just so much fun. So I've read the first 3, absolutely adore them. I think they're not just for kids. I think adults would have an amazing time reading them as well. So I had to put it in there as my top recommendation. And she's Australian. Then the other honourable mentions that I have, which are not in our top 10 or anything, but I just had to mention them because they're the ones that I read growing up and absolutely will always have a soft spot for, John Marsden. Yes. Who pretty much was writing young adult before young adult was even its own kind of established genre. He wrote Tomorrow series, which is the first book's called Tomorrow When the War Began, and it follows a girl called Ellie, a teenage girl called Ellie, who goes camping with her friends at a time when there's a massive national festival happening. So everyone else goes to this festival, and she instead goes camping in the middle of nowhere in the bush. It's called, I think they call it Hell.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're off doing their camping adventure, and then they realise overnight that Australia has been invaded, and all of their families are captured on this fairground, and they can't get out. And just because they weren't there and everyone else was there, they're the only kids that are around who can do something about the invasion. So then they end up having to fight, like form this little army and fight against the invaders. Then the other two is Melina Marchetta, who is an Italian-Australian author, writing from the kind of Italian community in Sydney. And she writes coming of age kind of stories following women mainly. She wrote Saving Francesca, Looking for Alibrandi, On the Jellicoe Road, always following some teenage romance, but it's very much about identity and growth. The last one I want to recommend is actually a fantasy author for children who wrote a fantasy series called Deltora Quest, which I don't think is very well known outside of Australia, but I really loved it. And I just remember that there was a part where they were like going through the jungle on vines and things, and I used to pretend to be the main female character called Jasmine, which was also I loved Jasmine. I loved Aladdin as well, so I love pretending to be any kind of Jasmine. But this one in particular was like a jungle girl who could like swing on vines and stuff like that. And I can't remember exactly. I feel like they had to collect some kind of gems and these magical gems, and each book you filled in another gem from this belt, but followed teenagers on those sort of that kind of quest. And what I remember really loving was that there were some logic kind of questions in there that they had to answer as well. So it kind of gave you as the reader a chance to participate and try to guess it yourself and see if you could solve the riddles and things, which I really loved. And I remember doing it with all my school friends as well, like testing them and seeing if they got the answers too. So it was lots of fun. So yeah, I think that's our top recommendations for Australian authors. I'll link all the ones we mentioned down below, some of their top works, and you can check them out a bit more.
They're worth reading. They really are.
They're definitely worth it. And let us know, of course, in the comments down below if you have any other suggestions that we should be checking out as well. I'm always keen to learn more about Australian fiction, particularly in recent years when I've been living in London. I feel like I might have missed some new authors on the scene. So anyone with works recently out that I should know about, please let me know, because I'd be very keen to check it out. Thanks everyone for watching, and see you again soon. Bye.
And bye, Rodda.